She checked her lipstick in the hallway mirror before 6 in the morning, 1954, not knowing one of these 15 rules would end a friendship down the street. Nobody handed her these 15 rules in a book. They came from her mother, from her aunts, from the woman 2 houses down who noticed everything. Some were about her face, some about her house, some about how she carried herself down a sidewalk. Rule number 11 is the one that cost a young shop girl her job over a single pair of gloves, and we are only getting started. 2 years after the war ended, a Paris designer named Christian Dior showed a collection that used 20 yards of fabric in a single skirt, at a time when women had spent years rationing every scrap of cloth they owned. American magazines called it the new look, and by the early 1950s, it was not just a runway silhouette, it was homework, taught in home economics classrooms and copied at kitchen tables across the country. The first rule started with something smaller than a skirt, though. It started with her mouth. The rule was simple, and almost nobody wrote it down. Lipstick went on before anything else in the morning, and it never came off without warning. She would apply it, press her lips together on a folded tissue, and check the blot mark left behind. Too much color meant wipe and start again. A properly blotted mouth did not smear on a coffee cup, did not shine under kitchen light, and did not announce itself. That habit of blotting came from a very specific place, and it had nothing to do with vanity. Lipstick was one of the few luxuries a woman could buy on almost any budget, even in years when new dresses and new gloves were out of reach. Cosmetics companies leaned hard into that fact, selling color as the one thing she could control when so much else, fabric, money, her own schedule, was rationed or tight. A single tube lasted months and changed a face in seconds. That affordability is one reason the rule outlived the war, but the deeper reason had to do with what her bare face was thought to say about her household. An unpainted mouth on a grown woman answering her own front door was read, fairly or not, as a small sign something in the household was off that morning. Neighbors noticed these things without ever saying a word about it directly. So the lipstick was not just decoration, it was a signal that everything inside the house was under control, whether or not that was entirely true. Keeping that signal up every single day took real discipline, and it was only the first of 15 things she was expected to keep up. By the time she went to bed, that same lipstick routine reversed itself completely. Every bit of color, powder, and rouge included had to come off before her head touched the pillow, because leaving makeup on overnight was considered almost as careless as answering the door without any on at all. The nightly removal ritual had its own strict rule, and it revolved around a single jar that sat on nearly every American vanity table in the 1950s. That jar was cold cream, most often Pond's, a thick white cleanser that had been a fixture in American bathrooms since before her own mother was born. The rule taught alongside it was called the 2-cream method. 1 cream to melt away the day's makeup and grime, a second lighter cream massaged in afterward to leave the skin soft overnight. Skipping it, even once, was treated as a small defeat. Advertisements of the era promised it kept a woman's complexion looking cared for. The tissue she used to wipe it away mattered just as much as the cream itself. The method had an order, and women followed it the way they followed a recipe. First, she smoothed cold cream over her whole face and throat while the makeup was still on. Then she wiped it away with a clean tissue, taking the day's dirt and color with it. After that came a second, thinner cream, patted in rather than rubbed, left to soak in overnight while she slept. Skip a step, and it showed by morning in a way her own mother would have noticed before she said a word. Cold cream companies built entire ad campaigns around the idea that a soft complexion in the morning was proof of nightly discipline, not luck. Print ads showed actresses and ordinary homemakers side by side, both crediting the same jar. The claim was never that the cream performed magic overnight, only that consistency mattered more than any single application, which was a reasonably honest thing for a cosmetics company to say in 1953. The rule asked for patience more than money. and patience was about to be tested by something far more stubborn than a jar of cream. Skin had its nightly ritual. Hair had one that was, if anything, stricter, because unlike a complexion, a bad hairstyle could not be hidden under a scarf for the whole next day without everyone in the house knowing exactly why. The rule that governed her hair overnight involved small metal pins, a hairnet, and a level of discomfort she was simply expected to sleep through without complaint. Setting pin curls was an almost nightly task for women who wanted their hair to hold a shape without a trip to the salon. Damp sections of hair were wound tight around 2 fingers, pinned flat against the scalp in rows, and covered with a hairnet to keep the whole arrangement from shifting in her sleep. It was uncomfortable enough that some women joked their husbands slept in the guest room on pin curl nights, but the payoff came the next morning, in a routine that took real practice to get right the first few dozen times. Bobby pins had become cheap and plentiful enough by the 1950s that a woman might use 24 of them in a single night without thinking twice about the cost. Magazine ad campaigns of the era, the long-running Breck Girl illustrations among them, sold soft, wave-set hair as the natural result of good grooming, when in truth it took an uncomfortable nightly routine most women never discussed out loud. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew, and the reason they kept quiet about it had to do with how effortless they were expected to look by 9 in the morning. The standard was not just neat hair. It was hair that looked like it required no work at all, which is a much harder trick than it sounds. A woman who admitted to 2 hours of nightly pin curling risked seeming vain or high maintenance, so the labor stayed hidden and the result was presented as simply how she was. That gap between the real effort and the effortless appearance is one of the clearest threads running through nearly every rule on this list, and it shows up again almost immediately. Nowhere was that gap between hidden effort and effortless appearance more extreme than underneath her dress. An entire industry of boning, elastic, and hooks worked underneath her clothing to produce a silhouette that Paris had declared the new standard just a few years earlier, and almost nobody outside her own bedroom ever saw how it was actually built. When Christian Dior showed his new look in Paris in February of 1947, the cinched waist at the center of it was rarely a natural measurement, even on the professional models wearing it on the runway. American women who wanted that same silhouette were taught a very specific rule. The shape came from the garment underneath, not from the body itself, and there was no shame at all in engineering it, though almost nobody said the word engineering out loud. The full skirts that finished the look could use as much as 20 yards of fabric, an almost unthinkable amount for women who had spent years rationing cloth during the war. Underneath all that fabric sat a boned girdle or long-line foundation garment, laced or hooked snug enough to hold the waist in and push the ribs into the desired shape for an entire evening. It was not comfortable, and nobody claimed it was, but comfort was not really what the rule was selling, and getting used to wearing one for a full day was its own kind of education. By the middle of the decade, foundation garments of some kind, girdles, long-line bras, waist cinchers, were worn by the overwhelming majority of adult American women on any day she left the house, not just for special occasions. Department stores kept entire departments devoted to fitting them properly, with saleswomen trained to measure a customer and recommend the right level of boning and elastic for her frame and her day's plans. Getting fitted correctly was treated as seriously as getting fitted for shoes, and getting it wrong had consequences that showed up hours later, not right away. Some women who wore foundation garments daily said the firm structure made them stand straighter without thinking about it, since slouching against boning was simply less comfortable than sitting up. That is a subjective impression passed down through family stories rather than a medical claim, and it is worth holding loosely. But it does explain part of why so many women described the garment as more practical than punishing, even while admitting they could not wait to unhook it at the end of a long day, which is exactly the kind of detail that never made it into the advertisements. Whatever careful engineering she wore underneath, none of it mattered if her stockings gave her away first, and stockings came with a rule of their own, one that had nothing to do with comfort or hidden engineering, and everything to do with a single straight line running up the back of her leg, checked and rechecked throughout the day. Nylon stockings had only become widely available again a few years earlier. DuPont first sold them to the public back in 1940, and wartime rationing sent the material to parachutes instead of hosiery for years, creating shortages, and a single 1940 Delaware shipment reportedly sold 72,000 pairs, sold in a single day, with crowds lining up for blocks. By the early 1950s, supply had caught up with demand, but the memory of scarcity meant a run in a good pair of stockings still felt like a small crisis, and crisis is exactly why the seam rule existed in the first place. Stockings of the era were seamed up the back, a straight dark line that ran from heel to hem, and keeping that line perfectly vertical was treated as a genuine measure of a well-put-together woman. She checked it in shop windows, in compact mirrors, and asked friends to look at the back of her legs before she walked into a room full of people. A crooked seam was a small, fixable thing, but leaving it crooked in public was considered careless, and carelessness was the one impression a woman almost never wanted to leave behind her, literally. Asking a friend to check your seams was, in its own small way, an act of trust repeated constantly throughout the day, at church, at the grocery store, on a park bench. It gave women a built-in reason to look closely at each other and help each other look right before stepping into public view. That small courtesy is exactly the kind of unwritten cooperation this channel keeps finding underneath rules that look, on the surface, like pure vanity. And vanity is the wrong word for most of what came next as well. That covers her face, her hair, and everything holding her silhouette together underneath her clothes. But plenty of the rules she was taught had nothing to do with how she looked at all. Some of the strictest ones governed what happened inside her own house, long after the front door was closed and no neighbor could see her at all. Home economics classes taught in public high schools across the country treated sewing, budgeting, and grooming as a real subject, graded like arithmetic, not an optional hobby for girls who happened to like it. One of the very first things taught in that classroom, and repeated at kitchen tables by mothers who never took the class themselves, was how to save real money on a woman's hair without ever setting foot in a salon, using a small box that promised nobody would ever be able to tell the difference. The Toni Home Permanent launched in 1945 and was bought by Procter & Gamble just 3 years later, and its advertising built one of the cleverest campaigns of the decade around a simple dare. "Which twin has the Toni?" the ads asked, showing two identical sisters side by side, one with a professional salon wave, one with the home kit, daring readers to guess which was which. Most readers could not tell them apart, and that was exactly the point the company wanted to make, and the reason it worked came down to simple arithmetic. A salon permanent wave in the early 1950s could run $10 to $15, a real expense at a time when median family income sat around $3,300 a year. A Toni home kit cost roughly $2 and let a mother and daughter do the same process together at the kitchen sink on a Saturday afternoon. The savings were not small, and neither was the time spent together, which magazine advertising of the era mentioned surprisingly often, right alongside a warning about exactly how long to leave the solution in. Doing a home perm together took real trust, since leaving the solution in too long or too short a time changed the whole result, and there was no professional in the room to fix a mistake. That shared risk is part of why women remember these afternoons so clearly decades later, not just as a beauty task, but as one of the few times a mother sat still with her daughter with nowhere else to be. And that same kitchen table transmission of a skill shows up again in the very next rule, with a needle instead of a curling rod. Sewing was taught the same way. mother to daughter, using a paper pattern from a company like Butterick, McCall's, or Simplicity that usually costs somewhere between 35 and 50 cents at the local fabric counter. The rule was straightforward. A woman with even modest sewing skill could copy a fashionable silhouette she had only seen in a magazine for a small fraction of what the same look cost ready-made in a department store, provided she could actually read the pattern correctly, which was its own small skill. Reading a pattern meant understanding notches, darts, grain lines, and seam allowances well enough to cut expensive fabric only once, since a mistake could ruin an entire yard of material she had saved for weeks to buy. Home economics classrooms drilled this directly, often having students sew a full garment as a graded project. Many women who took that class as teenagers can still describe the exact stitch they were taught, which is exactly the kind of detail that survived while the rule around it quietly disappeared, along with a much stricter one about writing letters. The broader rule underneath both the perm and the pattern was the same. Looking put together did not require real money. It required a set of learned skills passed down carefully and practiced often. A ready-made dress from a Sears catalog might run $10 to $15, real money against a household budget of a few $1,000s a year. So making your own version of that silhouette was treated less like a hobby and more like a household skill, right alongside a much stricter one that had nothing to do with money at all. Buying fabric was its own small ceremony at the yard goods counter, where a clerk measured and cut from a bolt while she decided between a print for a day dress and a solid for something dressier. It was a rule of patience as much as budget, since the right fabric might take 2 or 3 trips to find. But patience with fabric was nothing compared to the patience demanded by a much smaller, much stricter rule involving a stack of blank cards and a fountain pen. Emily Post's Etiquette Manual, first published in 1922 and still the dominant conduct guide of the 1950s in a newly revised edition, was blunt about correspondence. A thank you note for a gift or a dinner invitation was expected within 24 hours, not a week, not whenever she found the time. Waiting longer than that was considered a real social lapse, the kind neighbors and relatives noticed and quietly remembered, sometimes for years, which made the next rule feel almost merciful by comparison. A prompt note signaled something bigger than good manners. It signaled that a household was running smoothly enough to keep up with its social obligations without letting anything slip. Falling behind on notes, on calls, on obligations of that kind was treated as a visible crack in a woman's reputation for competence, even though nobody would ever say so directly to her face. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more demanding rules on this entire list, right up until the rule that governed her own front door. That front door rule was one of the strictest of all 15. A woman was expected to be presentable, hair done, some color on her lips, a clean house dress at minimum, before she ever opened it, whether the person knocking was the mailman, a neighbor, or her own mother-in-law arriving unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. There was a reason that particular rule got enforced more strictly than almost any other on this list. Answering the door in curlers or without a scrap of makeup was treated as something close to being caught in your slip. A small exposure most women worked hard to avoid, even for a 2-minute exchange with the mailman. Did your mother or grandmother keep a rule like that in your house? Something she would never be caught doing in front of a neighbor? I would love to hear about it in the comments. That same instinct, never let anyone catch the machinery running, shows up again in the very next rule, and it gets even stricter. That machinery, the lipstick, the pin curls, the girdle, the fresh house dress, all had to be running before anyone outside the family ever saw her. No exceptions made for a headache or a bad night's sleep. And remember, rule number 11 is the one that cost a shop girl her job over a single pair of gloves. We are getting close to it now. Keeping all of that running took real money as well as real effort. And money was the one resource most households genuinely did not have much of to spare. So the rules around clothing itself were built almost entirely around stretching a small budget as far as it could possibly go, starting with the single most expensive item in her closet. A good winter coat was often the single biggest clothing purchase a family made in a year, sometimes costing close to what a week or two of the household's income actually was, against a median family income of roughly $3,300 a year in 1950. The rule was one good coat in a classic cut and neutral color, then everything else, dresses, blouses, skirts, built around pieces that could be mixed and reworn without anyone noticing the repetition, a small trick that depended on a second rule about accessories we have not reached yet. The trick behind rewearing the same handful of pieces was simple. Change the accessories, the collar, the belt, or the scarf, and most people registered the outfit as new, even when the dress underneath had been worn a dozen times already. Women's magazines ran entire features on stretching a five-piece wardrobe into what looked like 15 different outfits, and home economics classes taught the underlying math of it as seriously as they taught sewing itself, and that math only worked if the accessories themselves followed a rule of their own. Everything so far had mostly played out inside her own house, in front of a mirror, at a kitchen table, behind a closed front door. Out in public, on a sidewalk, or in a department store, a whole second set of rules took over, and they were, if anything, less forgiving than anything that happened at home. White cotton gloves were considered mandatory for a woman heading downtown, to church or to a formal visit, and going without them was noticed immediately by other women, even when men in the room never registered it at all. This was the rule etiquette writer Emily Post codified plainly in her guide, and it is also the rule that got a young department store saleswoman sent home to change on the spot over nothing more than a bare hand at the perfume counter. The story, retold in period etiquette columns and in family recollections passed down since, goes like this. A young saleswoman showed up to her shift at a downtown department store without her gloves, having left them on the streetcar that morning, and her floor supervisor sent her straight back out to buy a replacement pair before she could work the counter. No exceptions. It cost her half a day's wages and, for a while, the friendliness of a coworker who thought she was making a scene over nothing, and that small rift says a lot about how seriously other women took a rule that men barely noticed at all. Gloves covered hands that did real work. Washing dishes, wringing laundry, gardening, and a clean pair signaled that a woman had the means and the discipline to present hands that looked like they had never done any of it. It was a small, deliberate fiction that everyone participated in and almost nobody discussed directly, which is exactly the pattern running through most of these 15 rules once you start looking closely. And it shows up again the moment you look at what she wore on her head. Emily Post's etiquette guide was specific down to the hour about hats. A woman kept her hat on for daytime engagements, but by 6 in the evening, the rule flipped entirely, and she was expected to either go bareheaded or switch to a proper evening headpiece instead. Showing up to a 6 o'clock dinner still wearing her daytime hat was considered a small but real misstep, one that said more about her sense of occasion than her sense of style. Hats were such a fixture of daytime dress that most respectable women owned several, rotated by season and occasion, from a simple straw hat for daytime errands to a more formal felt or veiled style for church and visiting. A woman without a hat downtown on a weekday was almost as noticeable as a woman without shoes, an oddity people would actually turn and look at twice, which is hard to imagine now that almost nobody wears one at all. Part of the hat rule was practical, since a proper hat shaded her face from the sun and was required by many churches at the time as a sign of respect during services. But part of it was pure social signaling. A quick, wordless way to announce that she understood exactly what kind of occasion she was walking into and had dressed accordingly down to the hour of the day, a skill that mattered just as much sitting perfectly still as it did walking through a doorway. That same instinct for occasion carried straight into how she was taught to sit, stand, and walk across a room, a set of skills entire schools were built around teaching to ordinary middle-class girls, not just debutantes headed for society balls at a price many families were willing to pay for a few weeks of lessons. The John Robert Powers Agency and the Barbizon School of Modeling, founded in 1939, both ran charm school courses through the post-war years that taught posture, a level walk, and a graceful way of sitting down without ever glancing at the chair first. The signature drill, walking with a book balanced flat on top of the head, has become a bit of a punchline today, but it was taken completely seriously at the time as real, practical training, and the reasoning behind it was more useful than the punchline version of the story usually lets on. A woman who could walk with a book balanced on her head, by definition, was not slouching, was not looking down at her own feet, and was moving at a controlled, even pace, all things Post's etiquette guide and every charm school of the era treated as evidence of self-command. It was a strange-looking drill built around a genuinely sensible goal, which is true of more of these rules than people usually give them credit for, and the same logic of visible self-command shows up again in something as small as a handbag. The rule was short and absolute. Her handbag and her shoes had to match in color and ideally in material every single time she left the house. Navy shoes meant a navy handbag. Black patent leather pumps meant a black patent leather bag. A mismatch was the kind of small detail other women clocked instantly, and a woman herself would notice the second she caught her reflection in a shop window. And fixing it usually meant an entire wardrobe built around 2 or 3 color families instead of one. Building a wardrobe around 2 or 3 tightly matched color families, navy and cream or black and red, meant a woman could rotate a small number of coats, dresses, and accessories, and still always have a matching bag and shoe combination on hand, no matter which outfit she reached for that morning. It was, in effect, a quiet planning discipline dressed up as a simple style rule, the same kind of discipline that also decided which shade of lipstick she reached for on any given day. That brings us back to where we started, her mouth, except this time the rule was not about whether she wore lipstick, but about which shade she chose, and the choice was treated as far more personal than most people today would assume, thanks in large part to one advertising campaign that changed how an entire country thought about lipstick color. In 1952, Revlon launched a campaign called Fire and Ice, photographed by Richard Avedon and built around an idea from advertising executive Kay Daly. Instead of just selling a lipstick color, sell a personality quiz asking, "Are you made for fire and ice?" Millions of women took it seriously, comparing results with friends the way people compare any personality quiz today, and the specific red the campaign sold became one of the best-known shades of the decade, and choosing wrong was treated as a small but real social miscalculation. The genius of the campaign, and the rule it reinforced, was treating lipstick shade as a form of self-expression rather than a fixed uniform, decades before that idea became mainstream marketing language. A woman was taught to think about which red suited her coloring, her personality, even her plans for the evening, turning a 5-minute decision at the vanity table into something closer to choosing an outfit for her whole personality. And personality, it turns out, is exactly where all 15 of these rules were quietly pointing the whole time. Taken together, these 15 rules were not 15 separate habits. They were one interconnected system. A woman's face signaling one thing, her house signaling another, her posture and her accessories signaling a third, all pointing toward the same overall impression of a household fully under control. Pull on any single thread, a missed thank you note, a bare hand at church, and the whole picture wobbled just slightly, even if nobody could quite say why, which is precisely the kind of system that starts to unravel the moment one generation stops teaching it to the next. That unraveling started sooner than people usually assume. Formality was already loosening in casual suburban settings by the late 1950s, years before the more dramatic cultural shifts of the following decade. Girdles, hats worn for routine errands, rigid glove etiquette, all of it began sliding out of daily use well before anyone declared the era officially over. And the generation that grew up watching their mothers keep these rules were the ones who eventually walked away from most of them. By the 1960s, many daughters of women who had followed these 15 rules faithfully rejected them outright, seeing girdles and hats and glove etiquette as symbols of a restriction their mothers had simply accepted without question. It was not an unreasonable reading of what they had watched growing up, but it also missed something their mothers rarely explained out loud, something closer to quiet competence than blind obedience. Nearly every rule on this list, looked at closely, was less about pleasing a husband and more about a woman demonstrating competence to the one audience that actually judged her most closely day to day, which was other women. Neighbors, sisters, co-workers, the woman 2 houses down who noticed everything. They were the real audience these rules were performed for, far more than any man in the house ever was, and that detail changes how the whole list should be read. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, not because she was smarter than anyone alive today, but because she absorbed a genuinely coherent system of small daily signals from women who came before her. And she never had reason to write any of it down since everyone around her already knew it too, which is exactly why so much of it nearly vanished within a single generation once nobody was left teaching it at the kitchen table. That near vanishing is part of why interest in this exact material has come back around in recent years. Vintage-style pin curls, seamed stockings, and structured foundation garments have shown up again on social platforms in the 2020s, chosen deliberately by younger women as a style statement rather than followed as an obligation the way they once were, and that shift from obligation to choice is really the whole story in miniature. Interest in the underlying skills, sewing, mending, budgeting a household on a tight income, has also resurged amid cost of living pressures in recent years, echoing the exact same thrift-driven motivations that built rules like the home perm and the home-sewn dress back in the 1950s in the first place, which suggests these rules were never really about a specific decade at all. Think back to the woman checking her lipstick in that hallway mirror in 1954. The friendship that ended over one of these rules was not a large, dramatic falling out. It was smaller and pettier than that. A next-door neighbor once corrected her handbag and shoe combination in front of 3 other women at a bridge club, loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, and the 2 women were never quite as close again, a small, permanent chill that started over nothing bigger than a mismatched shade of brown. It is tempting to hear a story like that and conclude the rules were petty or cruel, and in that one moment, maybe they were. But the same women who policed each other over a handbag also covered for each other constantly, checking seams, swapping patterns, teaching each other's daughters to set pin curls, in a network of mutual help that rarely gets remembered alongside the pettiness, and that dual nature is really what this whole channel keeps circling back to. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud back then, in the specific way a woman held her seams straight, or blotted her lipstick or timed her hat by the clock on the wall. None of it made it into history textbooks. Almost none of it survives in family photo albums either, since a photograph only shows the finished result, never the 15 small disciplines that built it, which is exactly why so much of it very nearly disappeared for good. It vanished, but it worked. At least on its own terms, for the specific women living inside that specific decade, trying to hold a household and a reputation together with a fraction of the money and none of the modern conveniences we take for granted now. Judging it only by today's standards misses what it actually accomplished for the women who lived it every single day, and that is worth sitting with for a moment before we close this one out. 15 rules, most of them never written down in full, most of them taught quietly, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, over a kitchen table or a fence line, kept an entire generation of American women looking and feeling like everything was firmly in hand, even on the days when it absolutely was not, which might be the most honest thing anyone ever admitted about the whole system. If you grew up around a mother or grandmother who still checked her lipstick before answering the door, or who would not dream of a crooked seam, you were closer to this whole system than you probably realized at the time. It was not history to her. It was simply Tuesday, and Tuesday, it turns out, is exactly where most of what we call history actually happens. The attic remembers, even when we forget, and that is really the whole reason a channel like this one exists at all, to go back through the boxes, the etiquette guides, the old advertisements, and pull these small unwritten rules back out into the light before the last women who actually lived them are no longer here to confirm any of it firsthand. And that particular clock is the one thing about this whole subject that will not wait. Every seam checked in a shop window, every thank you note written the same night, every book balanced on a hallway floor during a charm school lesson, all of it added up to a way of moving through the world that an entire generation of women understood without ever needing it spelled out. That is worth preserving accurately, neither mocked as silly nor romanticized as some lost golden age. Just understood clearly for what it actually was, which is the only honest way to close out a list like this one. 15 rules is really just the number that fit neatly into a title. There were dozens more, smaller ones, about which glove finger you mended first, about exactly how long you let a cold cream sit before wiping it away, most of them lost entirely now, known only in fragments passed down through whichever grandmother happened to mention them once at a holiday table, which is exactly the kind of fragment this channel exists to go looking for. So the next time you come across an old photograph of a woman from this era, perfectly composed, hat level, gloves on, seam straight, lipstick fresh, try looking past the composure itself and toward everything quietly holding it up: the mother who taught her, the neighbor who checked her seams, the 15 small rules nobody bothered to write down because everybody already knew them by heart. And that is really where this particular story ought to end. These 15 rules were never really about lipstick or gloves or a straight seam up the back of a stocking. They were about a generation of women deciding, quietly and without ever being asked, that competence and care were things worth performing every single day, even in private, even when nobody was watching closely enough to notice the effort at all. If any of these 15 rules sound like something your own mother or grandmother kept without ever explaining why, I would love to hear which one in the comments, because there is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud, and this channel is exactly where we keep going back to find it. Thank you for spending this time in the attic with me.